The storm had passed, but what Ezekiel Marsh found in his yard defied all logic. Two Apache women lay unconscious near his dying cattle. But these weren't ordinary women. They were giants. Absolute giants among their people, each standing taller than any man he'd ever met. The shorter one, even crumpled on the ground, looked like she'd tower over 6 feet. Her frame was powerful, built for warfare, for survival. The taller one was something else entirely. Massive. Nearly 7 feet of solid muscle and bone, with shoulders broader than any settler Ezekiel had ever laid eyes on. Apache women of this size were the stuff of legends. Whispers you'd hear around a frontier fire. Warrior daughters of powerful chiefs, trained from birth to fight like men, but tasked with the sacred duty of carrying on the bloodlines. They never, ever traveled alone. And they certainly never appeared on a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere without a war party close behind. The beadwork on their torn clothing was intricate, a clear mark of high birth. The jewelry alone was probably worth more than Ezekiel's entire property, his dying cattle included. Blood seeped from a wound in the shorter one's side, while the taller one's breathing was a labored, painful gasp. They'd taken serious injuries. They were running from something dangerous enough to separate them from their protectors. Every survival instinct Ezekiel had screamed one single, undeniable truth. Helping Apache meant death for a settler like him. That was the iron law of this unforgiving land. But then the massive woman's eyes flickered open. They locked onto his, and what he saw in them shattered every assumption he'd ever held about Apache warriors. It wasn't fury. It wasn't hatred. It was desperate human fear. The same terror he felt every morning when he looked at his parched fields and sick animals. The terror of knowing you were powerless to stop the end from coming. She tried to speak. Her voice, though raspy, was deep and strong, but she only managed a single word in her native tongue before her eyes rolled back and she was gone again. Standing over two fallen giants who could crush him with their bare hands, Ezekiel realized the next few minutes would define him. He would either be the biggest fool on the frontier, or he'd find a strength he never knew he had. The choice that would change everything came down to 3 minutes and 2 dying giants. Ezekiel knelt, his hands trembling as he checked their injuries. Even lying down, their size was just intimidating. The shorter one's frame stretched nearly 6.5 feet, her muscled arms thicker than most men's legs. The taller one was a true giant, probably closer to 7 feet. Her broad shoulders were wider than his cabin doorway. Both of them had the lean, hard muscle of trained fighters. The shorter giant had a nasty gash in her ribs. Maybe a broken branch from the storm, maybe a blade. Dark blood stained the earth beneath her, and her breathing rattled in her chest. The taller one had a deep cut across her forehead, but her eyes were now open, alert, watching his every single move with a dangerous intensity. It was a stark reminder that these women could snap his neck without a second thought. His ranch was 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, 40 miles from town. Out here, helping Apache was signing your own death warrant. Men had been hanged for less, accused of being a collaborator, of choosing the wrong side in a war that showed no mercy. The wounded giant's breathing grew shallower. Ezekiel had seen enough dying cattle to know the signs. She had an hour, maybe less. "Please," the conscious giant whispered. Her English was broken, but her voice carried a deep, commanding tone. This was a woman used to being obeyed. "Help, sister." The word sister hit Ezekiel like a punch. He thought of his own sister, Elizabeth, lost to fever 3 winters back. But looking at these two massive women, he knew they were more than just family. They were Apache royalty, warrior daughters whose disappearance would bring entire war parties down on this valley, hunting for answers. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Another storm was coming, and 2 giants would die in his yard if he did nothing. His neighbors would find the bodies eventually. They'd probably assume he'd killed them defending his property. That story would protect him. It might even earn him some respect in town. He'd be the man who took down 2 Apache warriors. But as he stared into the conscious woman's face, at her high cheekbones weathered by the wind, at her dark eyes that held no pleading, only a tired, resigned acceptance, something inside him just cracked. This wasn't about Apache or settlers anymore. This was about 2 human beings bleeding out in front of him while he stood there, calculating the cost of his own soul. "Damn it," he muttered, sliding his arms under the wounded giant's shoulders. She was impossibly heavy, solid muscle under torn buckskin. She weighed more than a full-grown steer. The conscious giant struggled to her feet, swaying, but she was determined to help carry her sister. Her own imposing height made Ezekiel feel like a child standing next to her. Together, they staggered toward his small cabin. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff's edge. The wounded woman's weight was nearly crushing him. Behind them, the wind picked up. It brought the scent of rain and something else. Dust. Dust clouds on the southern ridge. That could only mean one thing. Riders. As they finally reached his doorway, Ezekiel realized his cabin entrance was too narrow. The wounded giant's broad shoulders wouldn't fit. They'd have to turn her sideways, praying they didn't make her injury worse. "They come," the conscious giant whispered, her grip tightening on her sister's legs as she stared at the horizon. Soon enough, the riders appeared on the ridge. 5 of them, silhouetted against the dying light like wolves hunting wounded prey. Ezekiel pressed his back against the cabin wall, peering through a crack in the shutters. 5 Apache warriors sat on their horses, motionless, scanning the valley. Even from this distance, he could see the streaks of war paint on their faces and the rifles slung across their backs. "Your sister," he whispered to the conscious woman who had told him her name was Ayana. "What did she do? Why are they hunting you?" Ayana's jaw tightened. She pressed a torn strip of cloth against her sister's wound. Etel spoke against marriage. Chief's son wanted her. She said no. The simplicity of it was staggering. A woman refusing a powerful man. And now she and her sister were marked for death. He thought of his own freedom, the simple right to say no, to walk away. These women had no such luxury. Through the window, he saw the lead warrior raise his hand. He was pointing directly at Ezekiel's cabin. They had found the blood trail. "How many bullets?" Ayana asked quietly, her hand instinctively checking the knife at her belt. Ezekiel did a quick mental count. 12 rounds for his rifle, 6 for his pistol, against 5 seasoned fighters who knew this land like the back of their hand. "Not enough," he admitted, his voice grim. Just then, Etel's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, glassy with fever. She started speaking rapidly in Apache to her sister, her voice urgent despite her weakness. As Etel spoke, Ayana's expression grew darker and darker. "What is it? What did she say?" Ezekiel demanded. Ayana turned to him, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. "Warriors. Not here for us." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Here for you." The words made no sense. It was impossible. Ezekiel had never wronged the Apache. He'd never stolen their land or killed their people. His ranch sat on territory he'd purchased legally. He kept to himself. Why in God's name would they be hunting him? "Why me?" he whispered. Ayana studied his face with those sharp, dark eyes, as if trying to decide if he could handle the truth. Outside, the warriors began their slow, deliberate descent toward his cabin. They moved with the deadly patience of hunters who knew their prey was trapped. 3 moons ago, Ayana began slowly. Apache girl found near death. By the river. White man brought her to our village, left medicine, food, never gave name, never asked payment. She paused, watching him. "You remember now?" Ezekiel's breath caught in his throat. The girl by the creek, maybe 14 years old, half drowned and burning with a fever. He'd found her tangled in some branches while checking his water traps. He'd stayed with her, given her water and what little food he had, until she was strong enough to walk. Then he'd pointed her toward Apache territory and ridden away fast. He'd never told a soul. He never expected anything for it. It was just what you did. She was Chief's daughter. Ayanna continued, her voice low and intense. Chief Nalish swore a blood debt to the unnamed white man who saved her life. But some warriors, they say no debt is owed to a settler. They come to test the truth of her story. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, louder. Ezekiel realized with a sickening wave of horror that this wasn't about the women he'd just sheltered. This was about a debt he never knew he had, a life he'd saved without ever understanding the consequences. Outside his door, the horses stopped. A voice called out in Apache, sharp and demanding. Ayanna reached out, and her strong fingers gripped his arm. "What you do next," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "decides if you live as friend or die as enemy." The door shook under a heavy, pounding fist. A new voice called out, this time in rough English. "White man, we know you inside. Come out now." Ezekiel's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle. Beside him, Ayanna was helping her sister sit up against the wall. Both women were preparing for a fight. Etel was pale, but her dark eyes were alert now, fixed on the door with a grim determination. "If I go out, they might just kill me," Ezekiel whispered. "If I stay inside, they'll burn us all out." "No burn," Ayanna said firmly. "They test your courage, not seek war. This is the Apache way." Another voice joined the first, younger, more aggressive. "You help women who defy the chief's son. This makes you an enemy of the Apache people." Ezekiel saw the trap instantly. If he admitted to helping Ayanna and Etel, he was siding against a powerful man. If he denied it, he was a liar, and they already knew he was lying. Either way, he was a dead man. But then Ayanna's next words changed the entire game. "Tell them the truth," she whispered urgently, "about the river girl. Tell them your name." She was asking him to claim the blood debt, to identify himself as the man who saved the chief's daughter. It was an insane gamble. He'd be betting his life on the story of a 14-year-old girl he'd met months ago, betting that her father valued honor more than tribal politics. The pounding on the door grew more insistent. Through the window, Ezekiel saw two of the warriors moving toward his small barn, toward his horses. They were cutting off his escape. They were running out of time. Taking a deep breath, Ezekiel shouted through the door, his voice carrying farther and louder than he expected. "My name is Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, I pulled Chief Nalish's daughter from the creek waters, and I made sure she got home safe." An immediate heavy silence fell outside. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When the voice came again, the tone was different. Older, more measured. "Show yourself, Ezekiel Marsh, and bring the women." Ayanna nodded at him once. She helped her sister to her feet. Etel swayed, but she stayed upright, her hand pressed against her bandaged ribs. Together, the 3 of them moved toward the door. Ezekiel lifted the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door open. 5 Apache warriors sat on their horses in his yard. The war paint on their faces was sharp and menacing, but now he could see something else in their expressions. Uncertainty, maybe even a flicker of respect. The leader, an older man with gray hair threaded through his black braids, studied Ezekiel with intense curiosity. "You are smaller than the daughter described," the warrior said, his English slow and deliberate. "She said the white man was a giant who fought the river spirits for her." Despite the terror clawing at his throat, Ezekiel almost smiled. Kids always made stories bigger than life. "I'm just a rancher. She was caught in some fallen branches. I helped her get free." The leader's gaze shifted to Ayana and Itel. These women brought shame to the chief's son. Why do you help them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ezekiel felt the weight of 3 lives balancing on his next words. The other warriors waited, their hands resting on their weapons. Because they needed help, he said simply. Same reason I helped your chief's daughter. The gray-haired warrior studied him for a long, silent moment. Then he turned his horse and spoke in rapid Apache to the others. Their voices were low, urgent, an argument. When they finished, the leader looked back at Ezekiel. He saw something in the old warrior's eyes that might have been approval. Chief Nailish comes at sunrise, he announced. He will decide if the blood debt covers the defiance of these women. You will wait. And with that, they melted back into the shadows, leaving Ezekiel standing in his doorway with 2 giant Apache women and the longest night of his life stretched out before him. A death sentence, just waiting for the dawn. After the warriors were gone, he helped Ayana change her sister's bandages by the dim lamplight. The bleeding from Itel's wound had finally stopped, but the risk of infection was high. The torn flesh along her ribs looked angry and swollen. She never made a sound of complaint. Will he kill me? Ezekiel asked quietly, watching Ayana's practiced, gentle hands. Your chief? Nailish is a fair man, she replied, her eyes focused on her work. But his son has many friends among the warriors. They say a marriage to Itel would bring peace between 2 clans. She paused, testing the tightness of a knot. Peace is worth more than one white man's life. The brutal honesty of it was worse than any threat. Ezekiel understood politics. He knew how quickly a man's life could become a bargaining chip. His death might just be the price of tribal harmony. Why did she refuse him? He asked, nodding toward Itel, who was dozing fitfully against the cabin wall. Ayana's expression hardened into something fierce. The chief's son has taken 3 wives already. He beat 2 of them until they lost their babies. Itel saw what happens to women who cannot say no. She finally met his eyes, and her gaze was like fire. Some things are worse than death, Ezekiel Marsh. They worked in silence after that. The weight of the coming morning pressed down on them like a physical thing. Outside, coyotes called across the valley, their voices sharp and hungry. Ezekiel found himself counting the hours until sunrise, wondering if he'd live to hear them again. Near midnight, Itel stirred. Her fever had finally broken. She spoke softly to her sister in Apache, then turned to Ezekiel. Her eyes were clear now, intelligent. Thank you, she said, her English careful and precise, for helping, when help brings danger. Anyone would have done the same, Ezekiel replied, though he knew it wasn't true. The 2 sisters exchanged a look that said they knew it too. White men have helped Apache before, Itel continued slowly, but they never risk their lives for women who bring trouble. You are different. Ayana stood up, moving to the window to check the dark horizon. Different, she repeated softly. Maybe that is why you are still alive. Maybe that is why my father will listen to his daughter's words about the riverman. Or maybe it's why he'll kill me quick instead of slow, Ezekiel said, trying for a joke, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. Ayana turned back from the window. In the flickering lamplight, he saw something in her expression that made his breath catch in his chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. As if she saw something in him that he didn't even see in himself. Itel and I, she said, her voice low. We watched you tonight. We watched how you move, how you think, how you choose. She took a step closer. So close he could smell the faint scent of sage in her hair and see the incredible strength in her dark eyes. You are not like the other white men we know. The observation hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken possibility and undeniable danger. Ezekiel felt a warmth spread through his chest, an attraction so powerful and so completely forbidden it terrified him. Here he was, with death coming at sunrise, and all he could think about was the giant woman standing in front of him. Suddenly, a sound from outside made them all freeze. Horses, moving slow and steady through the darkness. It was too early for the chief, but it was far too late for friendly visitors. Ayana pressed herself against the window, her massive body as tense as a drawn bowstring. 3 riders, she whispered, her voice dropping into an urgent, dangerous tone. Not Apache. Her next words turned Ezekiel's blood to ice. White men, with badges. If settlers had discovered he had Apache women in his cabin, his confrontation with Chief Nailish in the morning would be the least of his problems. A familiar voice cut through the night. Marsh, we know you're in there. Come out slow. Hands where we can see 'em. Deputy Marshal William Kane stepped into the faint glow of the lamplight spilling from the cabin. His badge caught the light, a silver star shining like a warning. Behind him, 2 other lawmen fanned out, their hands resting on their gun belts with practiced ease. Marsh, we got reports of Apache in this area, Kane announced, his voice carrying the full weight of federal law. Tracking party says they headed this direction after hitting the Morrison place. Ezekiel's blood ran cold. The Morrison Ranch. If they'd been hit, the settlers would be screaming for blood. Any Apache found anywhere near here would be shot on sight, no questions asked. Behind him, in the shadows of the doorway, he sensed Ayana's massive frame tensing. Nearly 7 feet of trained warrior ready to fight. Even wounded, she was probably more dangerous than all 3 lawmen combined. Etel remained against the wall, but he could see her giant form was coiled, ready to spring despite her injuries. Haven't seen any Apache, Ezekiel lied, stepping fully outside and pulling the cabin door shut behind him. His body felt small, inadequate, a flimsy barrier between 2 worlds about to collide. Kane's eyes were cold and suspicious. That's so? Because there's blood on your porch, Marsh. Fresh blood. And a lot of it. He gestured to one of his men, who immediately knelt to examine the dark stains in the dirt. Cut myself, Ezekiel said, the lie coming easier than he expected. Chopping wood. Axe slipped on some wet timber, caught my arm. Show me the cut, Kane demanded, his eyes narrowing. Ezekiel's mind raced. He could try to fake it, maybe use his knife to make a fresh wound. But Kane was no fool. A federal marshal would know the difference between old blood and new. Marshal, the deputy examining the ground called out. This ain't from one person. Different spots, different amounts. And these footprints? He pointed to a series of deep impressions in the mud leading to the door. These are huge, bigger than any man I've ever seen. Kane's gaze locked onto the massive footprints. Footprints that could only belong to the giant Apache sisters. His eyes snapped back to Ezekiel. What kind of people you been hosting here, Marsh? Don't know what you mean, Ezekiel said, but he could feel sweat beading on his forehead. In a flash, Kane drew his pistol. Step away from that door. We're searching your place. You got a warrant? Ezekiel asked, knowing it was a pointless question. Out here, federal marshals were the law. Don't need one when we're hunting Indian killers, Kane replied coldly. Now stand aside. Ezekiel knew he had seconds before they found Ayana and Itel. Once that happened, all 3 of them were dead. The giant women for being Apache, him for harboring them. As Kane took a step toward the door, Ezekiel made a desperate, last-ditch decision. Wait, he called out. You're right, there are Apache here. 2 women, badly injured. They came to me seeking help. Kane's gun swung around, leveling directly at Ezekiel's chest. You admit to harboring hostiles? I admit to helping 2 dying human beings, Ezekiel said, his voice firm, surprising even himself. Same as I'd do for anyone. The marshal's face twisted in disgust. Apache sympathizer. You'll hang for this, Marsh. Behind the door, Ezekiel heard a faint movement. The giant sisters preparing for the fight they knew was coming. But before anyone could make another move, one of Cain's men shouted urgently from the edge of the yard, "Marshal, riders approaching from the north, too dark to see how many." Cain spun toward the sound, his attention momentarily diverted from Ezekiel. In the distance, the steady, rhythmic sound of approaching horses grew louder and louder. "Could be more Apache," Cain muttered, then raised his voice to his men. "Defensive positions. We'll settle with Marsh after we see who's coming." As the lawmen scrambled for cover, Ezekiel realized with a jolt that reinforcements were arriving. But whether they were coming as his salvation or his doom depended entirely on who rode out of the darkness and into the lamplight. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, a drumbeat of judgment that would arrive long before the dawn. The riders who emerged from the darkness weren't Apache, they were more lawmen, reinforcements Cain must have called for. "Marshal Cain," the lead rider called out, dismounting quickly. "We've got new orders from the territorial governor. All Apache harbored by settlers are to be brought in for questioning regarding the Morrison killings." Cain's confidence flooded back now that he had the numbers. 6 armed federal agents now surrounded Ezekiel's small property. Resistance was impossible. "Search every building," Cain ordered, a smug look on his face. "Bring out anyone you find." Ezekiel's heart hammered against his ribs. His confession had just doomed them all. In minutes, they'd find Ayanna and Itel, and it would all be over. But then, Ayanna did something that stunned everyone. She stepped out of the cabin on her own. Her massive frame filled the entire doorway before she emerged into the lamplight. Even the hardened marshals took an involuntary step back. None of them had ever seen an Apache woman of her size, her sheer presence. She carried herself like royalty, her nearly 7-foot frame moving with a deadly grace. "I am Ayanna, daughter of Chief Nalish," she announced, her English clear and powerful. "This man saved my sister's life. Apache law protects those who show mercy to our people." Itel followed her sister out. Her own imposing height and powerful, muscled frame made the marshals exchange nervous glances. These weren't just Apache women. These were giants, warriors. Cain, recovering his nerve, raised his rifle. "Apache law doesn't mean a damn thing out here. You're coming with us." "No," Ayanna said simply. Her voice was calm, but it carried an absolute authority that gave even Cain pause. "We are not." "You don't have a choice," Cain replied, but a flicker of uncertainty had crept into his voice. Something about the giant woman's confidence was deeply unsettling. Ayanna actually smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that reminded Ezekiel of the warriors who had been there just an hour before. "My father, the chief, comes at sunrise. He will speak for us then. Until he arrives, we remain under the protection of the blood debt owed to this man." "What blood debt?" Cain demanded, confused. Etel stepped forward, her massive frame casting a long shadow across the yard. 3 moons ago, this white rancher saved our youngest sister from drowning. Apache law says a life debt must be honored. This man claimed that debt tonight when he chose to help us. The marshals glanced at each other. They'd all heard stories of Apache blood debts, sacred obligations that even war parties were bound to honor. But they'd never seen a situation where a white settler was the one claiming it. "That's just Indian superstition," Cain blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Federal law supersedes your tribal customs." "Does it?" Ayanna asked quietly. "Then perhaps you can explain why the territorial governor himself signed a treaty last winter. A treaty that explicitly recognizes Apache legal customs in all matters involving tribal members." Cain's face went pale. The treaty was real. A political necessity to avoid an all-out war on the frontier. If these women were truly Chief Nalish's daughters, and if Ezekiel could prove he'd saved another of the chief's daughters, then federal law would be forced to recognize the blood debt, at least until the chief himself arrived to rule on the matter. "We'll wait until morning," Kane finally ground out, his voice tight with frustration. "But if your father doesn't show, or if his decision doesn't satisfy federal requirements, all three of you are coming with us. Or you're going into the ground." As the marshals set up a perimeter around the property, turning his ranch into a prison, Ezekiel realized that everything now hinged on one man. One decision that would come with the sun. The giant sisters had bought them a few more hours of life, but the morning would bring a judgment that could mean death for all of them. Ayanna moved to stand beside him, her imposing presence both a comfort and a terrifying reminder of the stakes. "My father is a wise man," she said quietly, her eyes on the armed men surrounding them. "But wisdom sometimes requires difficult choices." Looking at the rifles pointed at his home, Ezekiel understood that Chief Nalish's decision wouldn't just determine their fate, it would set a precedent. It would decide how Apache law and federal law would coexist, or collide, on this bloody frontier. As the long, cold night wore on, all they could do was wait for the sun, and pray that wisdom would prove stronger than politics. Dawn broke with the sound of approaching horses, just as Ayanna had promised. Ezekiel stood in his doorway, exhausted from a sleepless night spent watching federal marshals patrol his land. The giant sisters stood with him, their imposing frames serving as both his protection and a constant reminder of what was at stake. Marshal Kane emerged from behind a makeshift barricade, his rifle at the ready as a cloud of dust appeared on the northern horizon. "That better be your chief," he called out to Ayanna, "because if that's a war party, we start shooting." Ayanna straightened to her full, intimidating height. Her nearly 7 feet of trained muscle cast a long shadow in the early morning light. "My father comes as promised. He will speak, and you will listen to both Apache law and your own." The riders materialized from the dust. It wasn't the massive war party Kane had feared. It was Chief Nalish, accompanied by a small, carefully chosen group of 5 tribal elders. Their faces were painted for a formal ceremony, not for war. They approached slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated to show respect for both their own traditions and the federal authority they were confronting. Chief Nalish dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to command. He was older than Ezekiel had expected, maybe 50 winters, but his body carried the lean, hard strength of a lifelong survivor. His most striking feature was his eyes. They were intelligent, calculating, and completely unintimidated by the half-dozen armed marshals surrounding him. "Marshal Kane," the chief said in perfect, unaccented English, somehow already knowing the lawman's name. "You hold my daughters. This creates a problem between our peoples." Kane stepped forward, his silver badge catching the morning sun. "Your daughters are suspects in the murder of settlers at the Morrison place. They are wanted for questioning under federal law." "Mr. Morrison tried to force himself upon my daughters," Chief Nalish replied, his voice dangerously calm. "They defended their honor, as is their right. Apache law justifies their actions, and your federal treaty recognizes Apache law in matters involving tribal members." The legal chess match had begun. Ezekiel watched, mesmerized, as the 2 powerful men circled each other with words instead of weapons, each seeking an advantage through law rather than force. "Even if that's true," Kane countered, "harboring fugitives is a federal crime. This rancher broke the law when he helped them." Chief Nalish turned his full attention to Ezekiel. He studied him with an intense focus that felt like it could see right through him. "You are Ezekiel Marsh. 3 moons ago, you saved my youngest daughter from the creek." "Yes, sir," Ezekiel managed to say, feeling the weight of every eye in the yard on him. "For this, Apache law says I owe you a blood debt. A life for a life. the chief's voice carried across the yard with absolute authority. "But you have also saved 2 more of my daughters. This makes the debt complicated." Ayanna stepped closer to Ezekiel, her massive frame both protective and supportive. "Father," she said formally, using the Apache title, "this man risked everything for us. He has shown himself to be worthy of Apache respect." Chief Nalish nodded slowly. He reached into a leather bag on his saddle and withdrew something that made every man in the yard, Apache and white, go still. It was a necklace of carved bone and hammered silver, the kind worn only by family members of the highest rank. "3 lives saved," the chief announced, his words carrying the weight of tribal law. "This creates an obligation beyond a simple blood debt." He walked toward Ezekiel. "Ezekiel Marsh, you have proven yourself worthy of adoption into my family. You will become my son, through deed and through honor." Cain's rifle actually trembled in his hands. "You can't do that. You can't just adopt him and claim him." "Your own federal government recognizes our treaty rights," Chief Nalish interrupted smoothly, never taking his eyes off Ezekiel. "The treaty clearly states that the Apache people can adopt new members, and your own law protects adopted Apache family members from federal persecution when the matter falls under tribal jurisdiction." The sheer brilliance of the move struck Ezekiel like a bolt of lightning. In one masterful stroke, the chief had solved every single problem. He had secured protection for his daughters, granted legal immunity to Ezekiel, and subtly asserted his tribe's power, all while staying perfectly within the bounds of federal law. Chief Nalish held up the necklace. "Ezekiel Marsh," he asked, his voice formal and deep, "do you accept this adoption? Do you take my daughters as your sisters and my people as your people?" Looking at Ayanna and Etel, the 2 giant warriors who had trusted him with their lives, Ezekiel realized this was more than just legal maneuvering. It was a chance at something he'd never had, a family, a belonging, a chance to build a bridge between 2 worlds that had only ever known war. "I accept," he said, his voice clear and strong. Chief Nalish stepped forward and placed the heavy necklace around Ezekiel's neck. It felt like the weight of chains and the lightness of freedom, all at once. Cain holstered his pistol with a look of pure, unadulterated frustration. He had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. "This isn't over," he snarled. "There will be federal investigations." "Let them come," Chief Nalish said with quiet confidence. "Apache law is clear. The federal treaty honors Apache law. My son and my daughters are now under tribal protection." But as the chief prepared to leave with his elders, he turned back to Ezekiel. There was something that might have been amusement in his ancient, wise eyes. "Son," he said quietly, so only Ezekiel could hear, "tomorrow I will return, with a different decision. Tonight I want you to think very carefully about what adoption truly means." And with those cryptic words, he was gone, leaving Ezekiel a member of a new family, safe from the law, but more uncertain about his future than ever before. The next day, Chief Nalish returned with the decision that would change everything, forever. Ezekiel stood in his yard, the heavy adoption necklace a constant reminder of his new status. He was Apache now, in the eyes of the law and the tribe. But the chief's cryptic words about a different decision had haunted him through the night. Beside him, Ayanna towered in all her 7-foot glory. Her massive frame cast a long shadow as she watched her father approach with the same small group of elders. The months following his adoption had been a revelation. His failing ranch had, against all odds, transformed. It was now a thriving trading post, a neutral ground where Apache families came to trade goods with white settlers, all under the legal protection of the federal treaty. The giant sisters had proven to be incredible partners. Etel's imposing presence and sharp mind for business made negotiations smooth and profitable. and Ayana's incredible strength helped with construction and heavy labor that would have taken Ezekiel weeks to do alone. But success brought complications he had never anticipated. Every day spent working alongside Ayana, watching her move with a warrior's deadly grace, seeing the quiet intelligence behind her dark eyes, had twisted his feelings into something he couldn't ignore. Something impossible. She was his sister now, by Apache law, protected by sacred rules that carried a death sentence for anyone who broke them. "You struggle with this adoption," Etel had observed just the day before. Her own 6.5-foot frame made even simple conversations feel momentous. Apache law protects family, but sometimes a protection can become a prison. Now, as Chief Nailish dismounted with that same ceremonial dignity, Ezekiel wondered if the old man had somehow sensed the impossible situation he had created. "My son," the chief began, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment, "you have honored this adoption well. The Apache people see your worth. They see your protection of those who needed shelter." He paused, studying Ezekiel's face. "But I am an old man, and old men sometimes solve one problem only to create another." Ezekiel's heart began to race. The chief's calculating gaze moved from him to Ayana and back again. "When I made you a brother to my daughters," Chief Nailish continued, "I solved a problem of law, but I believe I created a problem of the heart." He gestured to the giant woman standing beside Ezekiel. "Ayana is a warrior, trained to fight and to lead. But she is also a woman who chooses her own path. Apache law respects such a choice." Ayana stepped forward. Her imposing height made even her powerful father look small by comparison. "Father," she said formally, "I choose to speak." "Speak then, daughter." Her deep voice carried across the yard with absolute clarity. "The man you named brother has shown honor beyond any man I have ever known. His heart is true. His courage has been proven." She paused, and her dark eyes met Ezekiel's. "But my heart does not see him as a brother. It sees him as a man worthy of a different bond." A slow smile spread across Chief Nailish's face, the same calculating expression that had terrified federal marshals. "Apache law has a solution for this as well. A brother who proves himself worthy can be released from the family bond by the chief's word, if his other family agrees." He turned to Itel. "Younger daughter, what say you?" Itel's massive frame straightened to its full, impressive height. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from the bond of brotherhood. He has earned the right to choose his own path." A wide grin transformed her imposing features. "And my sister has waited long enough for her happiness." "Then I speak the final decision," Chief Nailish announced, his voice echoing with authority. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from adoption. He is no longer my son by law." The words hung in the silent air. "But," the chief continued, his smile widening, "if he so chooses, he can become my son by marriage, if my giant daughter agrees to have him." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything the frontier had ever seen. Apache traditions blended seamlessly with territorial law, creating a marriage that was legal and binding in both worlds. The federal authorities, still smarting from their earlier legal defeat, could only watch as Ezekiel married into one of the most powerful Apache families in the territory. Etel served as the witness, her deep laughter ringing across the valley as she watched her sister's unbridled joy. And Ayana, standing nearly 7 feet tall in a traditional wedding dress, was a sight that took every single person's breath away. A giant among women, beautiful and deadly, who had chosen love over duty. The trading post prospered beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The story of the white rancher and his 2 giant Apache sisters-in-law became a legend across the territory. Settlers came from hundreds of miles away just to see the women who stood taller than most men and could outwork any 3 of them combined. The federal investigations quietly ceased when Washington realized the political value of a peaceful and profitable trading relationship. The small, failing ranch had become the foundation of a new kind of frontier, a community where size meant respect and strength was used to serve peace. Chief Nalish's truly shocking decision had finally been revealed. It wasn't just adopting a white settler, it was orchestrating an intricate legal and emotional chess game that freed his daughter to marry for love, all while securing tribal honor and federal protection. 6 months later, as Ezekiel watched his towering wife direct the construction of their new, expanded home, he realized that life's greatest blessings often come disguised as impossible problems. The giant Apache sisters had brought him not just love and prosperity, but a place in a world far larger and richer than any he had ever imagined possible. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.